Now, while all of this mega news has been unfolding, I actually turned my hands to something slightly different. I've written a piece for the website today, which is a preview of a big BBC Two documentary, 2 parts, big budget, about inequality. And it's called The Decade the Rich Won. And one of the things the programme focuses in on is this policy of quantitative easing, which is when central banks around the world pumped loads of money into the economy in a particular way that ended up benefiting people who owned assets. So shares in companies, or companies themselves, or property, or pensions. And one of the contributors to the documentary, maybe actually even the star of the documentary, he is an inequality economist who's a former trader who made loads of money and now has very strong opinions. His name is Gary Stevenson, and he's here now. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Adam.
I feel like I've been watching you on TV quite a lot, watching this documentary, and people will have seen you on TV now as well. So there's loads we can talk about. I mean, first of all, just your story going from kind of poacher turned gamekeeper a bit. What was that about?
Well, I mean, I always wanted to work in the city growing up. I grew up in East London, pretty poor background, good at maths, good at economics. It's that straight line into the city. I went to LSE and I was working in the city. I started working in June 2008, which is obviously everybody will know, just a few months before the crisis blew up. And my job was to bet on interest rates. So for those who don't know, interest rates collapsed to zero all over the world in 2008. And suddenly my job, and the job of people like me, was to bet on when will rates come up, which is, to simplify quite a lot, basically a bet on when will the economy recover. And the history of this is fascinating, actually, because in 2008, when the crisis happened, everybody bet rates would go up in 2009. And in 2009, they thought it'd be 2010. In 2010, it was 2011. In 2011, it was 2012. And at the beginning of 2020, before COVID, they were betting rates would normalise later that year. So for 12 consecutive years, these guys bet the recovery would be next year. And after sort of 2-3 years of seeing everyone be wrong, you start thinking, well, what's really going on? And I sort of really delved into the question of why aren't rates going up? Why is the economy not recovering? What is happening that we're not getting? And I basically came to the conclusion that economists and traders were just not understanding how important inequality was. So if I was right and inequality is the problem, it's not going to get fixed. The economy will not recover. So I went back to my desk and put a massive bet on that we would never have a recovery. And by the end of that year, 2011, I was Citibank's most profitable trader in the world.
How much money did you make for the bank in that?
I made $35 million for the bank that year.
Wow.
But I made that money by betting that really bad things would happen in the economy. And, the bank paid me a big sum of money and then they said, well done, mate, do it again next year. And there's only so many years you can do that, I think, especially if you come from a poor background and it's your family and your friends that are being affected. Before you start thinking, if I'm really the best at this, if I'm really right in my understanding, then surely I have to talk about it and to tell people.
Yeah. Okay, right. There's lots of things we need to untangle there, and it takes this documentary like 2 hours to do that. So we'll do the short version.
Yeah.
But let's start off with one of the reasons for the low interest rates was obviously like central banks deciding to keep interest rates low because they decide what they are. It's not just like a force of nature.
Yeah.
But also they were kept low by this thing called quantitative easing, QE. Have you ever managed to do a quick way of explaining what QE is to people who aren't familiar with it?
I could try my best.
Go for it.
Essentially, it's a system of long-term loans, basically. Usually the central bank keeps rates low by doing short-term loans to commercial banks like Lloyds or Halifax. But in this instance, after 2008, they thought that wasn't enough. We need to lend more money to the system long-term. And the way they do that is they look at people who own government bonds. And government bonds are loans to the government. So as we know, the government borrows a lot of money, and that comes from pension funds, from wealthy individuals, from sovereign wealth funds, big investment funds. And these are long-term loans, 5 years, 10 years. In quantitative easing, the central bank basically buys those loans off of the people who have lent money to the government. So say you've lent money to the British government for 10 years, suddenly the central bank, the Bank of England, comes in, buys that loan from you, and now you're sitting on the cash. So people who lent money to the government suddenly get their money now. And that brings interest rates very low because suddenly all of this money is pushed back into the system right now. So suddenly all the investment funds have loads of money now and they need to think, what are we going to do with it? Is that simple enough?
That's pretty good, actually, yeah.
It's not a simple thing to explain.
Yeah, and the whole idea is that it keeps the cost of borrowing low and keeps the supply of money in the system high. So therefore, banks will lend to businesses that need it, and businesses can get a loan at a cheaper rate than maybe they would have done otherwise, and that's meant to stimulate the economy. But as Guy Hans, who's quite a famous financial guy, he's the founder of Terra Firma Capital Partners, says in this documentary, he's quite honest about what that did for people who already owned quite a lot of stuff.
The government just poured enormous quantities of money into the system. Those of us in private equity got incredibly wealthy. In some ways, it's obvious that if you plonk a whole lot of money into the system, it's going to end up going to those who've got money. But in some ways, it's not. And the way it's not is that government assumes that money goes in and it gets spread equally, rather than realizing that money goes in and it gets attracted to money. If you've got money and more money appears, you will get it.
And then there's a really interesting bit when George Osborne, who of course was the Chancellor during the Tory Lib Dem coalition, when quantitative easing was really getting going, having been started by Alistair Darling, he says this, he's kind of quite honest about what the effect of QE was on lots of other people.
Well, QE is really difficult, this printing money, because its purpose is that people who already have something, like a house or a pension or some shares, will see the value of those things go up. That's what the policy is designed to do. And it feels unfair because the people who don't have those things aren't getting the benefits of the policy. But ultimately, I came to the conclusion it's better to try and keep the economy floating rather than let everything crash.
And that's the defence you hear from all former chancellors who've been involved in this, from Alistair Darling up to now, that quantitative easing was necessary to just keep the financial system going when it was teetering on the brink. Now, just explain to me, why is it that putting this extra money into the system means that people who have assets like pensions or houses or shares and things end up getting more money? I can't quite work out the link from A to B.
So the money gets into the system by the central bank, the Bank of England, buying loans to the government. Okay, well, who owns loans to the government? It's investment funds. And more than anything else, it's wealthy individuals. You know, the more money you have, the more money you've lent to the government, basically. So the money, at the first point it goes into the system, it's going to investment funds and wealthy individuals. Okay, and wealthy individuals are not going to go straight into the shops and spend that money. You know, very wealthy people, when they get money, they invest it. That's what very wealthy people do. And so straight away, it's going to push up stock prices and house prices. Before 2008, we all used to think, bad economy, stock prices down, house prices down. There was a guy sitting next to me, a trader, and he was like, look, it was about 2010. I was like, the economy's doing terribly. Stocks just go up and up and up. I'm going to short stocks. And I turned around to him and I said, look, stocks can't go down. They cannot go down because if the economy is weak, the central bank will print money. And if the economy is strong, they'll go up. You know, so if you give the money to investors, they will invest it.
Yeah.
And that doesn't support the economy, it supports asset prices.
There's also some stuff in the documentary just about the culture in the places that you used to work. And you tell this story about this kind of away day that you had.
You want to hear the story?
Yeah.
I've actually brought the hat with me. But if you
Did
can
you?
see it, yeah, you can see it. I thought you might ask. So.
Yeah, why don't you go and get right?
Okay.
Gary's going to now go and take his mic off and go and open his bag. And then I'll let you sit down and put your mic back on.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to be intrigued to see how you get this cap on over the top of the headset mic, but let's give it a go.
So, yeah, they used to have an away day for the traders once a year. Do you want me to put this on now?
Put it on now, yeah.
And it's not going to fit, I think.
It's not going to fit. Oh, well, I can see it anyway, so...
Yes.
And it says...
Go big or go home.
Go big or go
so
home.
I think this was the beginning of 2011. We had an away day for the traders. And all the traders, Citibank traders from all over the world, come to this one away day. And we walked in and straight away, they gave us these hats. And this hat said on the front, go big or go home. It's a little sort of army camo hat for those who can't see. And senior management sat us down and they said, look, if you think you're a good trader and you're willing to take a risk in $1 million, why not take it in $10 million? You know, go big or go home. And I couldn't believe they gave it's just it beggars belief really. So you know, afterwards all the traders went back and massively upped their risk, and then as soon as they lose a bit of money, they lose 10 times what they used to lose, and they have to stop their positions out. And it was a disaster. And that's why, you know, one of the reasons why I was Citibank's top trader in 2011 is because all the other traders got given these hats and started taking massively too much risk. But it's unbelievably irresponsible. But the thing is, there's this problem that goes all the way through the system, which is if you're an individual trader and you make loads of money, you get paid loads of money. But if you lose loads of money, you're not personally liable. And your boss is the same, right? And his boss is the same, and his boss is the same. And then what 2008 showed us is literally the entire bank is the same, right? All the way through the system, every individual, right up to senior management, to the entire corporation, is taking the profits when they win, and it goes to the government when they lose.
And if this sounds to people a bit like ancient history, because we're talking about 2008, 2011, actually it's not, because QE was done again on a massive scale at the start of the pandemic and is still being done now. So you're seeing the same thing
Enormous.
again.
450 billion, which is £10,000 for every single adult in the country. So if you're not sitting on £10,000 more than you were pre-COVID, someone else has got your £10,000. And I put videos out right at the beginning of COVID saying, look, this is going to cause big increases in inequality, big increases in stock prices, big increases in house prices and big increases in inflation. And I think we really need to ask, why is it that governments and economists feel the only thing they can do in crisis is to pump money in and make the rich unbelievably richer? You know, the first year of COVID was the biggest ever single-year increase in billionaire wealth in this country during the biggest economic disaster after the war. You know, is that right? Why is it that we've created a system when there's a crisis, the richest profit massively rather than paying higher taxes? And then what we're seeing now in March is national insurance being raised. And that's tax on ordinary workers that does not apply to the income of millionaires and billionaires.
But I think George Osborne says in the documentary, OK, the rich may have got richer and people might feel uncomfortable about that because not everyone got to participate in that. But he says average wages did OK. And so actually it's not like the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. It is just the rich getting richer.
But did they do OK relative to the cost of basic goods and services? You know, you don't need a degree in economics to see that, OK, yeah, wages didn't collapse like they did in, say, the Great Depression. But the cost of basic goods and services there was really high inflation in 2011. I don't know if you remember. It went up to sort of 5-6%. You know, and
basically where we are now.
What is amazing to me is that fewer people in the media are saying, "Look, it's a replay of 2008. We're doing the same thing. We're pumping money in. It's going to the rich, and sure, that keeps your wages up, but it also it's going to make house prices double. It pushes the cost of food and energy up. Why is it that we feel that we're not allowed to tax the rich? We feel the only way to deal with an economic crisis is to pump money in. Economists have sort of tied their hands. And, you know, it must be mentioned that we have a chancellor who's got an estimated worth of £200 million. And yet, when there's a crisis, it's never mentioned, well, maybe the rich should actually contribute. And what actually ends up happening, 2008 and COVID, is a massive increase in the wealth of the richest.
But nonetheless, QE being taken away seems to be causing problems as well, because actually they're starting to withdraw it now, aren't they?
Yeah, and, you know, I think QE is a complicated one because we saw a period where the rich got massively richer. And it would be easy to say, well, that's because of QE, we shouldn't have done QE. But actually, without QE, I think probably we would have seen 2008 play out a lot more like the Great Depression. And I think QE probably prevented that. But the problem is, with QE, it prevents some of the worst problems, but it causes massive increase in inequality, massive increase in the wealth of the richest, massive increase in house prices and stock prices. So QE is a great way to save us at times of extreme need. And nothing illustrates that better than what happened in COVID. It causes huge amounts of money to pile up with the richest. And if you don't go in afterwards and then tax the richest, you see exactly what we're seeing now. Big increase in house prices, big increase in inflation, and a massive fall in standard of living. So do the QE, accept that it's going to cause a massive increase in inequality, but you have to tax the richest afterwards. Otherwise, you're going to get this massive decrease in standard of living. It should be obvious. And
we could do a whole other podcast and 2-hour documentary series on the right level of tax for the rich, as you're talking about there. Anyway, Gary, thank you so much. I can see why you were so suited to being a trader, because your brain works like 1,000,000 miles an hour.
Thank you. Hopefully that's good.
Well, that's all for this episode of Newscast. I have a sneaking suspicion the news is just about to take off at 1,000,000 miles an hour as well. Good luck, everyone. Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Well, thank you for making it to the end of another newscast. You clearly ooze stamina. Can I gently encourage you to subscribe to us on BBC Sounds, and then, without having to do anything else, our meandering chat will miraculously make its way to your phone.